January 3rd, 2026, 8:42 a.m. EST. Nicolas Maduro sits in a holding cell in Brooklyn. The cable news networks are celebrating. Democracy restored, justice served. The dictator falls. But while the world watches the political theater, I'm watching something far more revealing. I'm watching silver futures spike 3.8% in Asian trading. I'm watching oil inventories that haven't moved. I'm watching a currency that died 7 years ago, but somehow kept a man in power until this week. This isn't a story about politics. This is a story about the most catastrophic economic suicide in modern history. GDP has fallen by 80% in less than a decade, a collapse that makes the Great Depression look like a mild recession. This is the forensic audit of how you take the richest country in South America and turn it into an economic crime scene. Welcome to the Gray Ledger. I'm your AG Asian guy. And today, we're not celebrating Maduro's capture. We're dissecting the economic corpse that made his capture inevitable. Because the handcuffs they put on him this week, those were forged in 2013, the moment he inherited an economy built on a lie. Let me start with a number that explains everything. 303 billion barrels. That's Venezuela's proven oil reserves. The country holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, estimated at more than 300 billion barrels. Larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than the entire Middle East combined. Venezuela won the geological lottery, and then proceeded to go bankrupt. How do you lose $100 billion in GDP without a foreign invasion? How do you turn a country that was exporting 3 million barrels of oil per day into a nation that couldn't keep the lights on? The answer isn't sanctions. The answer isn't imperialism. The answer is something economists call Dutch disease. And Venezuela had the most terminal case in history. Here's how Dutch disease works. When you discover massive oil reserves, your currency gets strong. Really strong. So strong that it becomes cheaper to import everything than to produce anything domestically. Why grow tomatoes when you can buy them from Colombia for pennies? Why manufacture cars when you can import Toyotas? So Venezuela stopped making things. They stopped farming. They stopped building. They just pumped oil, sold it for dollars, and imported everything else. It worked beautifully, as long as oil stayed at $100 per barrel. But in 2013, when Maduro took power after Hugo Chavez died, he inherited something catastrophic. An economy in an acute stage of Dutch disease, remaining 96% dependent on oil exports for foreign currency. The non-oil economy had been completely destroyed. Venezuela was a one-product nation, and that one product was about to collapse. Here's where the economic malpractice begins. Years before Maduro even took office, the government had fired nearly 20,000 engineers and geologists from PDVSA, the state oil company. Why? Because they went on strike. They were protesting political interference. So the government replaced trained petroleum engineers with political loyalists, people who knew how to chant slogans but had no idea how to maintain high-pressure subterranean pipelines. Oil production in fields with high-quality crudes operated by the National Oil Company, Petróleos de Venezuela, SA, PDVSA, fell rapidly. When Maduro took office in 2013, Venezuela was producing 2.9 million barrels per day. By 2020, that number had collapsed to 337,000 barrels per day. That's an 88% decline. Years of underinvestment, corruption, and mismanagement at state-run oil company PDVSA have caused production to plummet from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to around 800,000 barrels per day in 2023. Imagine you own a bakery, you fire all the bakers, you stop buying flour, you sell the ovens for scrap metal, and then you act surprised when you have no bread to sell. That's the Maduro economic doctrine in a nutshell. But oil was just Act 1. The real economic catastrophe was what happened when the oil revenue stopped flowing. In late 2014, global oil prices collapsed from $100 per barrel to under $50. Venezuela's government suddenly faced a massive fiscal deficit, approaching 15% of GDP. They had two choices: cut spending or print money. They chose to print money. And they didn't just print a little. The money supply was regularly expanded by 20-30% per month, pushing Venezuela into a hyperinflationary spiral. This wasn't inflation. This was hyperinflation on a scale not seen since Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. Let me give you the numbers, because they are genuinely incomprehensible. In 2013, inflation was 56%, bad but manageable. By 2015, it hit 180%. By 2016, 254%. And then the dam broke. In 2018, inflation hit 130,000%. Some estimates for early 2019 put it over 300,000%. What does 300,000% inflation mean in real life? The currency, the bolivar, became literally worthless. Subsidized gasoline in Venezuela was not just the cheapest in the world, but often virtually free. This led to an estimated 100,000 barrels of petrol worth over $10 billion per year being smuggled across the border to Brazil and Colombia each day. People started weaving purses out of cash because the craft value was higher than the face value. And what was Maduro's response? Did he admit the mistake? Did he stop printing money? No, he declared an economic war. He blamed shopkeepers. He blamed the CIA. He blamed capitalist parasites. He sent the military to force stores to lower prices. Sell this TV for $10, the soldiers would say. So the shopkeeper sold the TV for $10. And then he had no money to buy a new TV to sell. The shelves went empty. This is where the economic crime becomes a humanitarian catastrophe. According to the National Living Conditions Survey, in COVI, by 2021, 95% of the population was living in poverty based on income, out of which 77% lived under extreme poverty. In 2016, a dark joke started circulating in Caracas. They called it the Maduro diet. The punchline, it makes you skinny, but it doesn't make you healthy. According to university studies, in 2016 alone, nearly 75% of the population lost an average of 19 pounds. Not from exercise, but from starvation. But here's where it gets even darker. The government created something called clap boxes, local production committees. These were subsidized food packages delivered directly to households. On paper, it sounds like disaster relief. In reality, it was a leash. If you protested against Maduro, no box for you. If you didn't sign the party loyalty list, no box for you. If your neighborhood voted opposition, maybe the truck breaks down that week. And it wasn't just about control, it was about theft. Investigations revealed the government was importing low-quality food, often unfit for human consumption, at massive markups. They were buying powdered milk with virtually no nutritional value, billing the Venezuelan state millions, and pocketing the difference. They turned starvation into a business model. Now let's talk about what happens when an entire economy collapses. People leave. Since 2014, roughly 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's 25% of the entire population. Imagine if every single person in Texas just left, or if the entire country of Switzerland packed up and moved. This is the largest displacement crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And who left? Everyone. But specifically the people you need to run a country. Doctors, engineers, teachers, oil technicians. Picture a hospital in Caracas in 2019. The power goes out because the electrical grid failed. The backup generator doesn't work because the parts were stolen. And the surgeon? He's not there. He's in Miami washing dishes because his surgeon's salary in Venezuela dropped to $6 per month. This brain drain is catastrophic. When the oil rigs broke down, the engineers who knew how to fix them were in Houston. When the power grid collapsed, the electrical engineers were in Madrid. Maduro was left ruling a country of ghosts and the elderly. And speaking of the power grid, let me tell you about March 2019. The day Venezuela went dark. For nearly a week, the entire country lost electricity. The Guri Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric plants in the world, which supplies 80% of the country's power, failed. Maduro claimed it was a cyber attack orchestrated by the CIA and Senator Marco Rubio. He literally claimed they hacked the dam from a laptop in Washington. The truth? Negligence. They stopped maintaining the equipment. They stopped cutting grass around substations, leading to fires. They let the system rot until it simply gave up. When the power died, the water pump stopped. You're in a tropical country with 90-degree heat, no air conditioning, no fans, and now no water coming out of the tap. People were scooping water from the Guairi River, a river so polluted it's basically liquid sewage, just to flush toilets. But the true horror was in hospitals. Neonatal incubators turned off. Dialysis machines stopped. We'll never know the exact death toll, but doctors reported patients dying simply because the machines keeping them alive had no power. Now, here's where the story takes a bizarre twist. By 2020, Venezuela was officially the Twilight Zone. Walk down one street and you see people digging through trash for food. Walk down the next street and you see a shiny new store called a Bodegon, selling Nutella, imported champagne, and PlayStation 5s. What happened? After years of screaming Yankee go home, Maduro quietly legalized the US dollar. By 2019, facing total collapse, the administration implicitly surrendered to the market. Price controls were abandoned and the US dollar was allowed to circulate freely. Suddenly, Venezuela became a two-tier society. Tier 1, the 95% of people earning bolivars worth nothing. Tier 2, the 5%, government cronies, military generals, and people with family abroad who had dollars. This created a bubble of luxury in Caracas. New restaurants opened with $100 steaks. But it was a mirage built on money laundering and remittances. The government wasn't producing anything. They were just washing dirty cash through luxury imports. But if the oil industry was dead and they weren't collecting taxes, where was the regime getting actual cash to pay the military? The answer, gold. And not the clean kind stored in vaults. Maduro created the Orinoco mining arc. A zone bigger than Portugal opened up for gold mining in the Venezuelan Amazon. But this wasn't industrial mining with safety standards. This was the Wild West. The regime handed control to a mix of military commanders and actual criminal syndicates, including Colombian guerrillas. They use mercury, toxic, poisonous mercury, to separate gold from dirt. That mercury flows into rivers, poisoning indigenous tribes and killing fish. The gold is then flown out on private planes to places like Turkey, the UAE, or Iran. It's sold for cash off the books. No receipts, no taxes, just bags of cash delivered to keep the inner circle happy. Venezuela holds Latin America's largest gold reserves. But instead of building a legitimate mining industry, Maduro turned it into an eco-terrorist operation. But here's where silver enters the story, and why commodity markets spiked the moment Maduro was captured. Venezuela was quietly producing silver as a byproduct of gold mining. Venezuela's silver production averaged 865 metric tons from 2016 to 2020, peaking at 1,675 metric tons in 2016 before collapsing to 480 metric tons in 2020. That silver was being exported through intermediaries to China and Russia, countries that were propping up Maduro's regime. The moment U.S. forces secured Caracas on January 3rd, those supply chains were severed. China loses access. Russia loses access. And approximately 800 metric tons of annual silver supply, small but significant in a market already running a massive deficit, just went offline. Now let's talk about the economic numbers that actually explain why Maduro was captured this week, not last year or next year. Between 2013 and 2025, Venezuela experienced the single largest economic contraction in modern history for a country not at war, with the economy evaporating approximately 80% of its GDP. That's worse than the Great Depression. That's worse than the Soviet collapse. GDP fell from $372.59 billion in 2012 to $43.79 billion in 2020. The IMF estimated that GDP shrunk to $80 billion in 2018 from $196 billion in 2013. Making the economy smaller than Guatemala's or Ethiopia's. Venezuela went from being the richest country in South America to being poorer than some of the poorest nations in Africa in just 7 years. But here's what ultimately nailed Maduro. The cash ran out. By late 2025, reports suggest that payments to top military brass started arriving late. The gold mines were being squeezed, drug routes were being intercepted, the loot was running out, and when generals can't pay their troops, loyalty becomes negotiable. Remember that $15 million bounty the U.S. had on Maduro's head? Every time he walked into a room with his bodyguards, he had to wonder, does that guy want to protect me, or does he want $15 million? When the economy is bankrupt, loyalty has a price tag. So here's the final verdict. Nicolas Maduro destroyed Venezuela through a systematic application of every wrong economic policy known to mankind. He inherited Dutch disease and made it terminal. He fired the experts and replaced them with loyalists. He printed money until the currency died. He weaponized food and turned starvation into leverage. He drove out 25% of the population. He let the infrastructure collapse. He dollarized the economy while maintaining a fiction of socialism. He turned gold mining into organized crime. And he did all of this while sitting on 303 billion barrels of oil and some of the largest mineral deposits in South America. Venezuela has an estimated $14.3 trillion worth of natural resources. 14 trillion. And somehow, Maduro managed to bankrupt the country anyway. The silver angle? That's just the canary in the coal mine. When Maduro fell, it wasn't just about oil or politics. It was about the systematic liquidation of every extractable asset, including silver, which was being smuggled out through shadow networks. The moment those networks got cut off, commodity markets reacted because they understood what the headlines missed. Venezuela wasn't just a regime change story, it was a supply chain disruption story. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a political victory. This is the inevitable conclusion of economic reality asserting itself. You can ignore the laws of economics for a while. You can print money, you can seize businesses, you can blame the CIA. But eventually, the numbers catch up. Eventually, the military realizes there's no more money to steal. Eventually, the bodyguards do the math on that $15 million bounty. Venezuela's gross domestic product, GDP, shrank by roughly 3/4 between 2014 and 2021. That's the bill. That's what economic malpractice costs. You can steal an election, you can silence the press, you can jail the opposition, but you can't fake GDP. You can't print your way to prosperity. And you can't run a country when 95% of the population is living in poverty. The economy that nailed Maduro wasn't built by the United States. It was built by Maduro himself, brick by brick, policy by policy, printing press by printing press. If you found this forensic analysis valuable, hit that like button. Subscribe to the Gray Ledger because the Venezuela story isn't over. The rebuilding phase is where the real money gets made, or lost. We'll be tracking who gets the mining concessions, who gets the oil contracts, and who ends up holding worthless Venezuelan bonds. Until next time, remember, Empires don't fall to invasions anymore. They fall to balance sheets. Stay sharp, stay solvent, and never forget, the economy always has the final word.